So thanks again for your time. So before we start, I have to read this preamble. It's just some logistical stuff, some formal information about this project. So today is Wednesday, December 16th of 2020. My name is Evan Solis. I'm interviewing Emmanuel Garcia for the Voces Oral History Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Please know, Mr. Garcia, that this interview will be placed in the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection at UT Austin. If there's anything you do not wish to answer or talk about, I will honor your wishes. Also, if there's something you do want to talk about, please bring it up and we'll talk about it. Because we are not conducting this interview in person, I need you to record you consenting. So I'll ask you a series of 5 questions. Please say, yes, I agree, or no, I do not agree after each one. And there are 2 questions we need to make sure you agree to before we go on. Voces wishes to archive your interview along with any other photographs and other documentation at the Benson Library at UT Austin. We will retain copyright of the interview and any other materials you donate to Voces. Do you give Voces to consent to archive your interview and your materials at the Benson Library?
Yes, I agree.
Thank you. Do you grant Voces copyright over the interview and any material you provide?
Yes, I agree.
Do you agree to allow us to post this interview on the internet where it may be viewed by people around the world?
Yes, I agree.
Okay, thank you. And then last 2 questions. We have many questions in a pre-interview form that we have already filled out. We use that information from the pre-interview form to help in research. The entire form is kept in a secure Voces server. Before we send it to the Benson, we would have stripped out any contact information for yourself or family members, so that will not be part of your public file, and your public file will only be accessible at the Benson Library. Do you wish for us to share the rest of your interview in your public file available to researchers at the Benson?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, and last one, on occasion, Voces receives requests from journalists who wish to contact our interview subjects. We only deal with legitimate news outlets. Do you give consent for us to share your phone numbers or your email with journalists?
Yes, I do.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Manny. So that's that. So we'll get right into it. To start off, I just kind of wanted to ask you if you could give us a brief background on you. So, just how would you describe yourself, your professional background, your educational background, and sort of your family, your personal life as well?
Sure. Well, I'm from the Rio Grande Valley. I'm from Bronzeville, Texas. I have 2 amazing kids, got married to amazing woman I met in high school, and have been together just about ever since. I came up to Austin, Texas to go to the University of Texas at Austin. Originally was an aerospace engineering major, and very quickly found out that was not my life's route. Really had took some time to adjust to a new world, and then think about what role I had moving forward in my community, in my state, in my profession. I find myself into government at UT Austin, and working on public policy, and very quickly also got wrapped up in a community of Latino professors at UT Austin, and added Mexican American Studies as a double major, and found myself in community and support there. I went on to get a master's in Mexican American Studies, the first master's student in Mexican American Studies at UT Austin, and I think in the state of Texas. It was a brand new program, and very exciting to go through that, and to focus on the sort of public policy route, the intersection of ethnic studies and public policy, and sort of go through that trail, always supported by a series of professors, a community of professors around UT Austin, and ultimately around a community of elected officials in just a few blocks away from UT Austin at the Texas Capitol. I say that my journey into politics is a little abnormal, as in many respects I started as an academic, working with these professors, researching, publishing pieces, going to conferences, working on education policy. Ultimately found myself inside the Texas Capitol advising members of the Texas House of Representatives, and went into the policy world, worked for Trey Martinez Fisher in the Texas House, became the director of policy for the Mexican American Legislative Caucus of the Texas House. And so I went from academics into the policy world, which is a bit more fast-paced than the policy world, and then I went from the policy world into the political world, which is a bit more fast-paced than the policy world. And so I've gone from academic to policy person to political hack in communications, and I was originally recruited to become the communications director for the Texas Democratic Party. And after a number of conversations, decided to take on that challenge. And since then, played various roles in politics and the Texas Democratic Party, and ultimately becoming its executive director in 2019, serving in various leadership roles over the past several years. And so, yeah, I've had quite the abnormal journey into politics, but it's been incredibly fun and rewarding to work on some of the toughest challenges that our state and our country sees, with some of the best people. And it's been my work to now to create progressive change in Texas.
Well, there is a lot I could ask you about from that background, but so I want to talk a lot about policy and your sort of your work specifically with Texas Democrats. But since this is Voces of a pandemic, I want to just start before we get into that, talking about the current moment that we're living, COVID-19, and ask you sort of two questions that you can just answer however it comes naturally. One, how has this affected you personally? You know, how have you lived this moment? Has it been challenging for you at an individual level, your family? You know, what would you say have been the difficulties of this year? And then also, just broadly speaking, we know that Latinos are overrepresented in deaths and infection rates, not just here in Austin, but in Texas and in the nation. And so how has this moment affected how you work with these communities and how you think about these communities, given the evident lack of equal access to care that these communities have?
Yeah. So on the personal front, our entire operation has been working from home since right after the Texas primary in March of 2020. And I've had my kids at home. They've been doing virtual schooling. You know, we've been in between them working on schooling upstairs. I'm working on politics downstairs. They learning politics by overhearing me on the phone and on conference calls constantly. And just hearing what goes on in my sort of daily conversation about things. My wife works at the in the federal government at the IRS, and so she's been going in to work almost the entire time. There was a short break that they had, but you know, in order to get out stimulus checks to people need to go to work. So, you know, it's been challenging to go through this. Politics is such a personal business, and in-person conversation, whether with your staff or volunteers or political events, is part of the fabric of the way things work. And you know, that emotional connection and authentic connection that is developed between a team is difficult to create when you're not in person in the middle of crisis, in the middle of the trenches, right? Instead, we have found a different way to sort of create that community. But it's certainly been challenging to get through this. You know, ultimately, my job is to run what amounted to a massive organization with over $20 million in political expenditures and over 200 people working on the team. And sometimes just often very, very, very tough conversations on politics. But everybody having those conversations from their living rooms instead of having them in person. You know, as far as our community, it saddens me immensely that you hear stories of the Rio Grande Valley and hospitals being overrun, and mobile morgues and people in trailers. And these are front page news stories on the New York Times. And it's become regular in the norm on cable news to hear about a border community in Texas dealing with COVID-19 and the pandemic. And yet no action from state government, a refusal from the federal government and from state government to make any sort of comprehensive plan and approach, and then an outright attack on local officials who are doing the best they can under the worst circumstances to try to bring resources to bear for their communities, but they need a partner in state government and in federal government to get something done. And there's been outright hostility from state government and federal government towards those communities. And I think it is no coincidence that those communities are largely people of color, Latinos, and African Americans. And that is the result and the dynamics of power and the value set that the majority party in Texas, the Republican Party, decides to embrace. And it's been incredibly frustrating. We had hoped that with so much devastation, that this country would unify, that people would come together and understand that that healthcare and this kind of policy is beyond any sort of ideological politics, that this is about saving people's lives. But it turned out that everything was about politics. Everything is controversial and divisive, from the very simple act of simply putting on a mask. And so it is incredibly sad that this is what our country has been going through, while other people across the world have figured out how to take on COVID-19, unify as a community, develop resources, deploy resources, and ultimately, go back to a different, a new normal, but a different, but certainly not the kind of crisis that we are experiencing, with hundreds of people dying every single day and tens of thousands of people who have now died in Texas.
Is there, you can hear the frustration when you talk about this, and it's very understandable, but is there anything, can you think of a moment that maybe gave you some hope? Was there a story you heard, or people, something that you saw in this, and how, especially with relation to communities of color, Latino communities, and anything that, inspired you, that you could take away, this is something that I'm glad I saw, and this was a good moment that came out of all this?
I find hope in the fact that when Texas was at some of its worst numbers in the summer, and now they're even worse than they were then, but at that point that was a peak. And we had the runoff in the Texas primary runoff election, and we had more Democratic turnout in that runoff than in modern history, in decades. And I found it incredibly inspiring that in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of all of this chaos, democracy kept moving on. People voted, went out, had their voice heard in unprecedented numbers, to make sure that they could have the change that they deserved. So I saw that moment in the runoff, and while typically runoffs in Texas politics are actually low information affairs with not many people coming out to vote, but to see those numbers be quite robust and that many people having their voice heard was definitely inspiring, moving into the general election and the challenge that we had ahead of us. And I'll say throughout this entire time, the energy, the activism, that we have seen from our community, many of our folks, many of our volunteers who called to get out the vote in March, they were engaging with us and calling to connect people to each other and figure out how to get resources to each other. At the end of the day, a political party is just a bunch of people who believe in a set of values. And my party, I've had local county parties before, when hurricanes strike, come together and figure out how to deploy resources to people. And they're big they're organizations, they're these communities. And so they jumped right into gear, and during Hurricane Harvey got water to people in different communities, raised resources for people in different communities. And when this pandemic hit, we saw our volunteers engage with us and engage with each other, and we developed platforms where they could engage with each other to make sure that they could get resources to each other, get information to each other, and connect with each other. And that was inspiring to see that, you know, a lot of folks think that politics is a dirty word, and that that parties are suspect, and these institutions are suspect. But when you really boil it down, it's just a bunch of folks who want good people into office to do good things. And that very same value exists in a number of our actions, and all of our actions, and that's shown more than ever in the kind of effort and the things that our volunteers do.
Yeah, you said political party is a set of values. What do you think are the values that define the Texas Democratic Organization in 2020?
Yeah, you know, we are a broad coalition of different communities from different backgrounds and different histories. And at the end of the day, we're about a fair shot for all. We're about making sure that no matter who you are or where you come from, that in Texas, you have an opportunity to get ahead. You have an opportunity to reach your dreams. And that's not political fluff. That's like when people are under attack, Democrats have fought back. When people are left out and left behind, it's Democrats who push forward and ask for more resources for these communities, fairer policies from every single aspect, whether that's making sure that everybody has a family doctor and we expand the Affordable Care Act, or whether that's making sure that people have good schools and better resources and are in a classroom where they're not overcrowded, or whether that's making sure that everybody gets paid what they're worth and has at least a minimum wage of $15. At the end of the day, at the core of all of these different policies, it's about making sure that people have a fair shot, that the system isn't tilted against them, and that in this place, in this state, and in this country, you ought to be able to get ahead if that's what you want to do. Nothing should be able to get in your way, and that's what the Democratic Party is all about making sure that our entire community, and everybody has an opportunity to get ahead.
You earlier you mentioned you criticized this lack of a comprehensive plan to respond to this COVID crisis. So what, from a policy standpoint, what do you think should have happened at the state level? Or what could have been done better, especially with regards, again, to the Latino communities and these underserved areas. So that on one side, so what should have been done, and also being in the minority, in the legislation, in the legislature here in Texas. What possibilities do y'all have for advancing, y'all's agenda? Is there any possibility for pushing for working with Republicans? So how does this? Yeah. What are the possibilities for what y'all want to do?
Yeah. Well, in the past couple of years, the Republican Party used to be called the Party of Local Control, and they believed that government should be small at every single level, and that government should be closest to the people. This was the rhetoric that they used to use. Well, in Texas, Democrats run El Paso, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, the Rio Grande Valley, Corpus Christi. Virtually every major city is run by Democrats. Most major counties are run by Democrats, the government level. And when this pandemic hit, you saw Democrats like Lina Hidalgo in Harris County. You saw Democrats in the Rio Grande Valley and in El Paso County. You saw Democrats in Bexar County around San Antonio working hard and putting into place policies to keep people safe. They were based on the recommendations of doctors and scientists. They were to ensure that people, that we could mitigate the spread of the coronavirus. And then beyond that, in Dallas County and Harris County, also beginning to explore economic policies to make sure that our businesses and people would not lose ground and could put food on the table. And what we saw in response to that from state government, that work that local government was doing, was a complete a complete sort of power grab. You saw Greg Abbott literally go out there and remove the power of local officials from being able to institute orders to mitigate the spread of COVID-19, and used these disaster relief powers to accumulate and gain more power and take it away from local officials, consolidate it in the governor's office, even ignore any requests from the legislature, and take control of the situation. And I think early on, Greg Abbott thought that the pandemic was going to be done in short order. Maybe he listened to Donald Trump, who thought it was going to miraculously go away, and he figured he could take a victory lap, that this would be done in a few weeks. And he removed all the power from local officials, so they can't do anything about the pandemic. It's all on him. He's going to say a couple things and he can take a victory lap. Yeah, at the end of the day, what happened is the pandemic just kept on spreading. There was no direction from the federal government, from the state government, and there was mixed messages from both of them about how people should respond to the pandemic. About the kind of care that you should take and the personal responsibility you need to take, and how you are connected to your entire family, your entire community, and all your coworkers, and you have a responsibility to wear a mask, stay home when possible, operate and work safely. If you own a business, make sure your employees are safe, and these kinds of bonds that we have with each other. And Greg Abbott and the federal government ignored all of that. It's why his approval rating on the handling of the coronavirus is now in the 30th percentile or so. It's because everybody saw what he did, Republican and Democrat, local officials across West Texas and the Panhandle. I mean, you had Latinos in meat packing plants in the Texas Panhandle, story after story of these workers on the front line getting sick and dying. And the state government doing nothing. And so what could have been done? There needed to be a comprehensive statewide plan. There needed to be action early. There needed to be immediate moves. What did they do? They decided to take a wait and see approach. And when they saw that cases were on the decline, they decided to take away all power from local officials, open the state back up, and hope that everything was going to be fine so they could then take a victory lap on it. Meanwhile, local officials had to make all the tough choices, the politically tough choices that weren't popular, but were necessary to save lives. And the result has now been further spread in Texas becoming one of the worst states in the country on the pandemic, with more cases and more deaths than just about anybody else. And so, what should be done? Listen to local officials. They are talking to their local hospitals every day. They understand what is going on, where the resources are at, and what they need. You have to listen to local officials. You have to listen to doctors and scientists. You have to listen to workers who are telling their stories about how dangerous things are. And what could the Texas legislature do moving forward? Well, for God's sakes, Washington, D.C., even Washington, D.C. came to an agreement to put some money in people's hands. It wasn't a lot of money, that stimulus check, and it's not enough, and it needs to be more. But Austin, Texas, the Texas legislature has done nothing. Now, they were not in a regular Texas state legislative session. The legislature only meets 140 days every other year, unless the governor calls us in for a special session. Those are 30-day windows when new legislation can be drafted. And it's really telling that Governor Abbott, this entire time, as tens of thousands of people died, did not think it was time for legislation and for the Texas state legislature to come into Austin, Texas, and pass new legislation to save people's lives. I mean, I think that just goes to show how little they thought of this and how they were not prepared for any of this, and how they felt that at some point they just decided that deaths are okay, that they should not have to take any action. So we're just a few weeks away from the Texas state legislature coming into regular session now. This is going to be the first opportunity of the legislature to have its voice heard on a number of matters, including the governor's power in crises. And I think you're going to see Democrats and Republicans of both parties come together and say something needs to change. When anybody is ready to come together and make sure that people's lives are improved, Texas Democrats will be there, and we are ready to cut that deal. And if they don't want to, then we'll be ready for a fight. But to me, I think you're seeing the largest healthcare pandemic in our history, largest economic crisis in modern history. There needs to be action from our government. And just sitting back and waiting for this to solve itself, that's not going to happen.
So I want to change tactics a little bit and ask you about this election cycle, this general election. That for us, we're saturated with this news. There's news every day, and it's there's a lot going on. But to think that this interview might be watched 10 years in the future, 20 years in the future, can you just talk about this moment in history from your perspective as the executive director of Texas Democrats? What were the challenges of this election during this pandemic? How do you think the state of Texas responded to those challenges? How do you think the election went? Not necessarily the results. I'm just talking about the process itself. What was that like?
Yeah. Well, part of it that is all sort of connected is, for the first time in decades, Texas was considered a battleground state, and it really affected a lot of things that were going on. We called ourselves the biggest battleground state in the country, and years ago, I've heard many donors and many people in politics say you're shooting too high. You can't say something like that. You're going to let people down. And to me, you have to shoot for the moon. You have to fight hard. You have to call the moonshot, because that shows us where we need to go. And what this state can be. And, at the beginning of this 4-year presidential cycle, it was considered a joke to think about Texas as a battleground state. At the end of this 4-year cycle, just a few weeks ago after the election, the chair of the Democratic National Committee, Tom Perez, one who campaigned in Texas in the last few days, and two, went on cable news and said, take this to the bank, Texas is a battleground state in 2024. We have come a long way in a very short amount of time, because Texas has dramatically changed. Who the Texas electorate is, who is Texas, has changed. We have grown by millions. The electorate has grown by millions, now over 17 million registered voters. The newly registered voters are younger, they are people of color, they are women, they are Texas Democrats, and our coalition has grown incredibly. At the end of the day, the result was a single-digit outcome, less than 6 points in Texas, better than Iowa and Ohio. We're about where Georgia was in 2016, and Democrats won in Georgia in 2020. The South, the Southwest, Arizona, Georgia, Texas, they are the future of the Democratic Party. And the National Democratic Party now understands that. Now they see that. Now, on the nuts and bolts of the election, you know, local elected officials, Texas elections are run by counties as well as the Secretary of State. So it's supposed to be a collaboration. And you saw in Harris County, Democrats doing everything they could to open access to the ballot box. More drop-off locations for people who wanted to vote by mail, but were concerned that the post office would not get their ballot in time, so they could drive through and drop it off. Drive-through voting sites, new innovations so that people could go and not have to step out of their car and subject themselves to a small area where the coronavirus could potentially be present. 24-hour voting, locations that were going to stay open so that shift workers could go and vote. Lots of innovations happened in Harris County. And it's because Democrats led the way there. And every step of the way, the Texas Secretary of State, and Governor Greg Abbott, and Ken Paxton sued us and tried to stop access to the ballot box, whether it was on vote by mail, whether it was on these drop-off locations, whether it was on drive-through voting. On every single turn that Democrats took to expand access to the ballot box, Republicans used state government to suppress people's voices. This has been a long story in Texas history for decades. Decades this has been done. And both parties are at fault for this. Years ago, a white Democratic Party gerrymandered districts to make sure that people of color could not get represented, to use their votes to gain office, but to make sure that they weren't represented in their government. But now, in modern times, in the past few decades, you have seen Republicans use power to set up a system and make sure that it is rigged against Texas's growing electorate and the new Texas that is out there. And every single lever that they have at their disposal, they have used to make it harder for people to vote. So in many respects, from that 30,000-foot view, it is remarkable that Texas is a battleground state. It's remarkable that we had a single-digit outcome. It's remarkable that we have increased our dominance in urban Texas and have now taken over much of suburban Texas. And while many Democrats across the country down ballot lost the gains that they had made in 2016 and 2018 in Texas, we held the line. And so we had hoped for much more. We had hoped to win up and down the ballot. We had hoped to take the Texas House, to win more congressional seats, to do more. But ultimately, when you look at the entire national context and the pandemic we were facing, and the fact that the Republican Party uses government to make sure that people don't have a voice in their community and in their government, it's kind of remarkable what has happened. We're now over 5.2 million Texans voted for Democrats. That's 1.3 million more than in the previous presidential cycle. That's more than 200,000 more than what the Republicans grew. There was a Trump surge and there was a Democratic surge. The Democratic surge grew larger than the Republican surge. The Republicans had a better starting point. Now, with all that, at the end of the day, though, in Texas, you still have millions of people who are not participating in elections. And that's not through any fault of their own. These folks understand what is going on. Campaigns and candidates and parties need to earn their trust. And we need to do everything we can to also fight government so that people can have their voice at the ballot box. Because voter suppression is very real, and it holds people back from having a stake in the future of their community.
So I'm hearing a lot of optimism, a lot of positive takeaways from this cycle. But I want to ask you about specifically the Latino, the increased Latino vote for Trump in this last election, and especially here in Texas. I'm thinking of Starr County, which is on the border, majority almost entirely Hispanic Latino, and had a huge shift. I think it was something like 50 points from 2016 to between 2020 towards Donald Trump, and that just seems indicative of something that, well, I mean, from depending on where you're standing, it's something that is either very good or very bad, something going wrong or well. So what do you think is going right or went right for the Republicans and Trump? What is it about that message, or what is it about Trump that appeals to these voters? And what does the Democrat Party need to do better to, like you said, earn their trust again, get these voters back into the Democratic fold?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. One is, let me start with the Texas Latino community is incredibly diverse, both in generation, some 5, 6 generation Texans. They were here before Texas was Texas. Some new immigrants, some mixed status families, and different histories, whether you live in urban Texas, whether you live in rural Texas, or whether you live in South Texas and in the border region. And so there is a tremendous amount of diversity in the Texas Latino community. When you aggregate everything up, Latinos still voted at about 70% for the Democratic Party. And when you look into urban areas like Houston and Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, the Democratic percentage for Joe Biden from the Latino community was higher than it was for Hillary Clinton. And so there are multiple stories happening here at the same time. In urban Texas and in mass and in number, more Latinos are voting for the Democratic Party, and in percentage, more Latinos are voting for the Democratic Party. However, in a number of rural counties in Texas, a number of smaller counties in Texas, like Starr County, where 2,000 Republicans voted for Donald Trump, and 1,800 Democrats voted for Joe Biden. I think the number is 1,820 for Joe Biden and 1,816 for MJ Hager for United States Senate. Only 4 people dropped off between president and the U.S. Senate, and yet MJ Hager won Starr County over John Cornyn. And so yes, there was that swing, but that does not mean, one, that does not mean those were Democrats who became Republicans. That may have been non-voters who became voters. And 2, that doesn't mean that support was carried all the way down ballot for the entirety of the Republican Party. It may have only been for Donald Trump, which, what that says about the Republican Party's future is rather troubling for them, and they need to think about that. Now, what does it say for us? Well, we need to look at the environment in which people were living and really dive deep into what's going on. Now, I think there's a lot of things sort of broken with campaigning and the way modern these campaigns are run. But when you think about it, people's lives were threatened, but then they saw a campaign of misinformation that told them their livelihoods were being threatened, and that their livelihoods were being threatened by Democrats. The Democrats wanted to shut businesses down. The Democrats wanted to shut our communities down. That Democrats were going to threaten your oil and gas jobs. That Democrats were going to threaten your law enforcement jobs. And that is the misinformation that the Republican Party spread. And then what else did they do? They employed a number of tactics. Donald Trump signed his name on a stimulus check, and some of us sort of chuckled about that when that happened. I think the country had a bit of a chuckle that he was so vain that he wanted to put his name on these stimulus checks. It actually delayed the checks going out to people for a few weeks. But that's the best political mailer you could possibly send. I'm going to put money in your hands. They used coronavirus funding for food crates that were going to food banks, and they had a letter from the White House on top of them from Donald Trump. And so families were getting food and money from Donald Trump. They used the power of incumbency in unprecedented ways, deeply unethical, breaking all norms. But to them, this was about politics and power, and they were going to use every single lever that they could. They didn't care if they lied to people, that this is what they were going to do. And so for a number of folks, they saw their lives were being threatened, their livelihoods were being threatened. They needed to put food on the table. Everything is falling apart. Somebody is telling me, you know, we need to shut down businesses to mitigate the spread if that's what the doctors and scientists say so. But that doctors and scientists, if that's what doctors and scientists say so, that blurs away. They just hear shut down, and they just hear that I can't go to work and I can't put food on the table. And so, you know, I think that's a lot of what happened. As far as our future, I think the Democratic Party needs to continue engaging with the Latino community and needs to take this very, very seriously. But we need to understand and put into context how incredibly diverse the community is, and the fact that the vast majority of the community does support us. But we can still do better, and we can increase turnout everywhere. And then there are portions of this community that we need to continue to earn support with, and do a better job at connecting with.
Yeah, Jorge Ramos wrote an op-ed in the New York Times relatively recently talking about what he calls the Christopher Columbus syndrome, which is this, you know, idea that the Latino community is rediscovered every couple of years, every 4 years by both parties, is his argument. So what do you think, specifically in Texas, and you know, taking into account, understanding that it is a diverse community in every way, but over the next 4 years leading up to 2024, what are some of the practices or policies or campaigns? How can and will Texas Democrats engage with these communities in meaningful ways so that when 2024 comes around, those relationships have hopefully been strengthened even more?
You know, the Republican Party decided years ago that the way it was going to win was through subtraction, making it harder for most people to vote, concentrating on only a set of people, and then wrapping around those people's lives. And to the extent of giving them like an alternate reality of the world. It's very impressive what they have thought through. Deeply unethical, but incredibly impressive, some of the things that they have done from a campaign's perspective. On the Democratic Party side, you know, I think what we need to really understand is, one, the Latino community is incredibly diverse, and it is not going to have the same history of the African American community. You cannot expect 90% support from the Latino community. That's not going to happen. You should stop comparing it to other communities. But you can still continue to increase and gain traction and gain more support and increase turnout. But you got to talk about the things that people actually deal with on a daily basis. You know, there was a huge controversy in the Democratic Party in this presidential primary about Medicare for all or expanding the Affordable Care Act. These were the two taglines that were done. And this was the progressives versus the center left on how to deal with healthcare. This is a conversation that played out in cable news and presidential debates and constant campaigning on this conversation in the Texas primary. And I bet virtually no non-voter in the Rio Grande Valley cares about the difference between Medicare for all or expanding the Affordable Care Act. They care that they don't have a family doctor. They care that they need to drive hours to get to a family doctor. We're missing the boat on some of these basics of the human experience and what's going on because we caught ourselves up in the deep weeds of policy. And it's not that that's not important. That's incredibly important, those deep weeds of policy. But that doesn't necessarily automatically connect with people's lives just because we got a slogan or something that capitalizes some policy platform. We need to really connect with people's lives and what things are going on and explain how this policy connects to everything, and then not talk to people in legalese policy matters that are the debate that you're going to have in the United States Congress or in the Texas Legislature. That they're voting to entrust you to have that debate there. At home, you need to be talking about the effect. You need to be talking about the practical effect, the everyday effect for somebody, and what that does for someone. And so I think we have a huge disconnect in our messaging and in our conversation with people. I also think we have a huge disconnection in just our branding, and how the Democratic Party is received by certain communities. And that's deeper than policy. It's deeper it's other sort of emotional cues that are going on. Campaigns don't think enough about these are really questions of identity and community, whether you're a Republican or whether you're a Democrat. And there's some deep-seated things that get you to the decision of choosing either party or choosing no party. And we need to understand those drivers of human decision-making more, and then respond to those. In Texas, some folks just think Democrats are losers because they haven't been in power for years. That started to change at the city level now that they see Democrats running so many large cities. But that's a process of changing an entire brand from being sort of do nothing decades ago to being lively and connected to and engaged with the community and fighting now. And that takes a lot of work. But that's also different style campaigning. And then, everybody jokes around about Democrats finding the religion in the last 2 weeks of the election, because that's when you see all the activity, and that's when you see people literally go to churches and engage with communities. And the fact is, you need to be a fabric of the community the entire time. You need to be earning trust the entire time. You need to be working on issues the entire time. And that can be done because there's always something to work towards. There's always improvement to work towards. It's not just when it's election time that it's time to organize. You can be doing that the entire time. We're moving into 2021. You have a January Texas State Legislative session. There are issues at play. You have county commission meetings every single week in Texas. There are issues at play. You have city council meetings. There are issues at play. All of these things affect our communities, whether it's from fixing the pothole, building the new sidewalk, making sure water gets to a certain area, over to a $15 minimum wage or healthcare. All of these issues are important, and there is a constant fight and struggle on them. And we need to be better about being in that fight consistently, not just on an election year.
From my perspective, just an outside observer, it seems like, at least at the national level, the national campaign, that the Latino communities were not really considered essential to this campaign, that the campaign was going for they were taking a different approach and focusing on different communities, which ultimately turned out to be successful for them. Biden won the election. But I mean, what are your thoughts? What do you think about the lack of Latino leadership in the upper echelons of the Biden campaign? Right. For me, it's disappointing to see how Julian Castro was completely sidelined, whereas other primary opponents were given sort of bigger roles to play. Just generally, it seems like, and there have been some Latino appointments that have been announced, but it seems like Latinos continue to be underrepresented at the highest levels of the party, or of this particular incoming administration. I mean, does that square with what you're seeing, or what do you think about that? And what do you think about Latino representation and the way the national campaign approached these communities?
Yeah, I think there's a complex story there. There were a number of Texans in the senior leadership in the Biden campaign, and a number of Latinos as well, who have roots and connections to Texas. And further, the chair of the Democratic National Committee was a Latino, Tom Perez, and that was really stark change when he took over the party, and the treatment that they had towards state parties, the engagement that they had with state parties, a very different relationship than what had existed before. We also have to remember that there are not as large in number as in Texas, but there are significant Latino communities in a number of Midwest battleground states. And those communities were actually very key and important to the pathway to victory and getting over 270 electoral votes. Arizona, Nevada, places in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, a community in Georgia as well. All of these communities were important to victory. And so while they maybe did not get as much attention publicly in cable news and in certain places, or by news outlets, on the campaign on the ground, they were critically important, especially when you realize that this election ultimately comes down to tens of thousands of votes in strategic areas. And so every single vote mattered, and every single vote from the Latino community was actually just critically important there. It maybe is not getting the credit that it deserves after the fact, when sort of the media sees what actually happened. But I think as more data comes in, as numbers sort of bear out, folks will realize how a few points more support in the Latino community in particular places was actually incredibly important, and really, really strategic. Is there a need for more increased representation at the national level and the upper echelons? Absolutely, there is. This is a country that's still very much going through a process of coming to grips of what the Latino community is and what it means to the future of this country, and how to engage and how to deal with the Latino community. When the only attention in politics for years is Latinos in Florida, suddenly the whole country thinks everybody's Latinos in Florida, everybody's a Cuban, and that's not what the community is. And so as people are being now sort of the national media, national politics are seeing different kinds of Latinos communities, Latinos in the Midwest, Latinos in Arizona, Latinos in Texas. There's different stories sort of beginning to emerge about the complexity of this community, and the importance of this community to the future of national politics. It's part of why doing politics in Texas is so incredibly rewarding and so amazing, is we are the epicenter of the demographic change. And we also happen to be the state that is just so large that when this state changes and becomes a Democratic state, there's absolutely no pathway to the White House for Republicans. And so the national consequence is massive. And that growth and that change is led by Texas Latinos. And so, this is something that in the next decade, both parties are going to deal with, and is really going to set the future of politics in the United States.
You said earlier in the conversation, you talked about bringing progressive change to Texas, and I'm thinking, it makes me think of, this conversation makes me think of Cristina Ramirez, who ran this progressive campaign for Senate, founded these organizations that are getting out the youth Latino vote, that are focused on young Latinos, the future of this electorate. And ultimately how she fell short, how she didn't, she wasn't able to win the primary against a centrist candidate. Do you think Texas is ready for a progressive candidate? Anytime soon? Do you think that that's a reasonable hope that someone who runs on an openly progressive campaign with progressive ideas can win statewide?
Yeah, I do. You know, I don't think it's about progressives versus moderates or conservatives in the way I view the party or the way I view a lot of campaigning. You know, to me, you know, you go back to the 2018 cycle, Beto O'Rourke is incredibly progressive. But it's not like the campaign was about the ideological issues. You know, when you drill down to it, folks are all sorts of things. They're not just one thing, and they don't just view one issue in a particular way, or because they have a certain ideological category, they view every issue in that particular way. Yeah, at the end of the day, to win a campaign, I think you need to have a connection with folks, and well they're gonna say, you know, I don't agree with them 100% of the time, but I'm impressed at the kind of fight that they have, and the boldness by which they show it, and the kind of style, and so I'm going to trust them on most of the time, and we're going to earn their vote. You know, years ago I started saying that the words Texas Democrats needed to gain some meaning, and you say that in certain places of the state, and you think about Ann Richards and Barbara Jordan and Lyndon Baines Johnson. And that's a certain style of Democrat. That's not any sort of weakness in a Democrat. They may all have different ideological perspectives, but there was a toughness to them. There was a style to them. It was a getting things done sort of attitude to them. It is that style that's sort of uniquely Texan, uniquely Texas Democratic. And it's that style that I think Texans of all stripes gravitate to and want to engage with, even if they don't agree with you 100% of the time. But if they see that you're a fighter, that you're ready to get something done, they're going to gravitate and connect to that. And I think that's what we need to see more of in our candidates. Being bold, being comfortable in their own skin, being unapologetic about who they are. There's nothing to be ashamed of. We believe what we believe. And then being willing to take on a fight. And I think those kinds of candidates, they get a deeper connection with people, with volunteers, and ultimately with the electorate. It's not to say that it's anything sort of ideological. It's more to say that it's about, you know, style, understanding people, connecting with people, and making sure that at the end of the day, they believe that you're going to do good things for their families. You know, and we've seen a lot of folks in the past several years, like Lisa Van de Putte. I worked for her in 2014, Latina, running for lieutenant governor, very progressive, different style about her, right? This was sort of before the more modern ideological fights of the Democratic Party, but fundamentally a progressive person. Lupe Valdez, who ran for governor, you know, she had a real interesting history with military and law enforcement in her background. But you know, when you go down the policies, she was very progressive. And she was a Texas Democrat, a regular person, who just worked her way up, and that has a connection with community. So, you know, to me, it's funny, right after an election, everybody's going back into their own camps, and the people who say we need to be more centrist and moderate are saying, see, I told you we need to be more centrist and moderate. The people who say we need to be more progressive are saying, see, I told you we need to be more progressive. Everybody's cherry picking their data on why they argue, going back into their corners. You know, the data is actually not in yet. The actual in-person, like person level data is not in the state file. It comes in January. That's when we can actually start drilling down and doing deeper analysis about all these things. But I think we're missing the boat when we think it's just a progressive versus moderate or centrist fight. I think there's something deeper to all of this stuff that that we're, as Democratic campaigns, we're not quite getting to, and we need to do we need to ask a lot more questions, and we need to drill a lot harder into figuring out where we go from here.
I want to circle back to the beginning of this conversation. You talked about being getting a master's in Mexican American Studies here at UT, being the first recipient of that degree, and sort of this interesting trajectory that you had, and the experiencing this overlap between ethnic studies and public policy. And so, reflecting on your career so far and the impact of those studies, what do you think that degree, Mexican American Studies, that program, what do you think that gave you? What have you carried with you? How has that influenced how you do your work, how you do what you do?
Yeah, you have to constantly be thinking about your priors, checking your assumptions, and iterating, getting better over and over and over again. Reflecting on yourself a lot, and then asking tough questions about why we do things a certain way, and just not being scared about that, right? Looking at things from a sort of, and sometimes taking away the personal and trying to understand the academic perspective of things and the research perspective of things, to see sort of what's going on, and then applying the personal into your passion, your experience, your understanding of a community and context. But being willing to open everything up and just kind of get radical and see what's really sort of going on. And a lot of folks in politics, they start getting into one camp or another camp, and they start sort of believing that certain things are third rails that cannot be touched, and certain things need to be run a certain way, and that's just the way it is. And to me, humans and communities are changing, and we're evolving at a very rapid pace. Things are constantly moving. The electorate is shifting from under us very, very quickly. And in this kind of dynamic environment, we should be open and curious, and we should be thinking about new approaches all of the time. Nothing should be set in stone, and we should be seeing where the community is the entire time. At the end of the day, it's about talking to voters to where they are at, to get them to to vote, to do this behavior, right? And so I think it very much prepared me for the research approach of being willing to not take political norms as gospel, and wanting to be sort of more inquisitive about things. The other part of it's not just sort of the textbook stuff. The other part of this is that it's community, and it's doors, it's opportunity. I would not be here had it not been for the University of Texas at Austin. The Center for Mexican American Studies at the time ultimately became the Department of Mexican American Studies, which I was blessed to be able to have a support role in helping, being one of the folks on the political end to help support it be coming into creation. And so it's about that entire community. Also sort of helps as you move forward in your career and your challenges and the things that you see the entire time.
Well, I really just have one more question for you, and it's, this has been a very strange year. A lot has happened. Definitely be a year that people look back on and study. And so, being in the thick of it in a lot of ways, being engaged with Latino communities, being the director of the Democratic Party here in Texas, what do you think are some of the biggest? What have you learned? What are going to be the biggest takeaways when you reflect on this year and say, yeah, this taught me that this experience with COVID or this election, this taught me this, or that,
Yeah. when COVID hit, we had to change everything we do, right? We are it's like an office, and it's hustling and bustling, and people are running around and on phone calls and engaging in in-person meetings and all of this stuff. And community is built because you're with your team, you're with your staff every day. You walk around the halls and you talk to people and you engage with people. And we couldn't have that kind of environment. And so we had to be very deliberate about creating community, about creating opportunities for people to engage with each other beyond the workplace, and making sure that people had support systems to talk with each other, making sure that people had the ability to create these bonds across departments, across staff, because we can often just be very siloed in our subject matter expertise and then not engage with the rest of the parts of the organization. And ultimately, ideas don't become better if we're not engaging with everybody and putting all of our brains together. And so these personal bonds are really critically important in developing them. We have a very strong team right now because they've gone through an unprecedented political challenge. And ultimately, we found other methods to connect and create that community. But some of these things that happened were incredibly groundbreaking. The Texas Democratic Convention is 10 to 15,000 people. It is the largest state Democratic convention in the country. It happens every other year. The Texas Democratic Convention this year was slated to go to San Antonio. We unfortunately could not do it because of the pandemic. It would have been in the summer. And so when faced with the decision of, do we make the convention small?
You're still pinned. That's good. Okay, I'm sorry. So you were talking about, the last thing that I heard was you're talking about the changes with the convention and how you're trying to bring folks together. Yeah. Can you just pick up where you?
Yeah. And so instead of, when faced with this unprecedented challenge, instead of making the convention smaller and just getting through the business and moving on, we figured out how to reimagine the opportunity. So we expanded the programming to an entire week of live streaming. We had dozens of panels, hundreds of speakers. Viewership increased to more than 500,000 just on Facebook alone. We had more delegates participate than ever before. People got invited to engage in this process. And the Texas Democratic Convention in 2020 was the first major political online convention. And it was the model for the Democratic National Convention that went online as well. The Democratic National Convention Committee was talking and engaging with our staff. They were learning from the issues that we faced as we presented a COVID-friendly environment with speakers and grouping speeches and panels and engagement and all of these things. We also, during the period, figured out how to train more than 3,000 deputy voter registration volunteers, and online, which was the largest training, single training in Texas ever of voter registrars. And we raised more money online than any state party in the country, breaking records. And we took an event that is usually a debt to the state party and turned it into an event that came out with a tremendous amount of profit and allowed us to then expand our operation shortly after the convention. That actually set the groundwork for the way political bus tours were now going to be run when there's no bus and you do it online. Our messaging team very much turned into a digital events production department, and they ran live streams for the United States Senate race. They ran live streams for the presidential race in Texas. They ran our own as well. They did hundreds of events, and they also taught other state parties on how to do them. The challenges we faced in every department, from data to training, voter protection, communications, finance, the way we service our counties and our candidates, all of that changed. And we were innovating and creating new program on the fly to be able to adapt to the pandemic, campaign in different ways, and support and run our functions in very different ways. And at the end of the day, it was a multi-million-dollar operation with hundreds of staffers. The largest the Democratic Party had been in modern history, and more resources than we had in any recent year. So I'm incredibly proud of the team and the staff and how they took on just an unprecedented challenge, and sort of got together and put their brains together and figured their way through these really challenging times and created all of these new innovative solutions. And now moving forward, it's going to be about merging some of that stuff, the new stuff with the old stuff, and researching more, finding out new solutions, figuring out what works. So it forced our campaigns to innovate. And that part's a good thing. And there was a lot of things we couldn't do. We couldn't go knock doors. And that was a detriment to us. We couldn't do some of the other things that we normally do, and that hurt us. But we also found a lot of new ways of campaigning and new things that should be done. And that was incredibly exciting to see and to build. And for the Texas Democratic Party, we're actually an operation that is rather rare across state parties in the country. We're quite large. Our team is quite large. In many states, the tradition is sort of the national committee or the presidential campaign really kind of takes over the state party and sort of runs the operation. And the state party in many respects is a bit of a shell of where all of these other participants play in. In Texas, we're so large, we're so complex, and we have built out such an impressive team that this team really was running the operation and was able to build this up, and it was just incredibly impressive, and so proud of the work that they did, which our voter protection plan was used in other states, in other battleground states. Our communications work, we were covered more than double than any state party in the country, more than 54,000 press hits, just sort of unprecedented levels of action, tens of millions of phone calls, tens of millions of text messages out to people, hundreds of mail pieces. Just the entire operation was huge. And so it was fun to do it during this time of just figuring out your way through the entire fog of this war. But it's something that I'll never forget. This team will never forget. And ultimately, I hope has now set Texas on a course towards true battleground state competitive status, and for Texas's voters to be heard by the entire country.
Well, I hope so too. And thank you, Manny. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you, to hear all this information you have. I appreciate it. I know Dr. Mag appreciates it, and I think this will be really valuable for researchers down the line. So thank you for giving us your time.
Sounds good. Thanks. I appreciate it.